Raz, dwa, trzy. Szanowni Państwo, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie na drugim dniu naszej
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the second day of our conference, the Countryside against Communism in Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th century. Yesterday, we discussed the background of all these events, the interwar period, the 1944, the political aspects, events in the Central and Eastern Europe and Poland. Today, however, we would like to discuss the last remaining aspect in the discussion. We will discuss the physical and formal, maybe mythologized aspects of resistance in the countryside, resistance against the communist system and the reality that was formed after 1944. So we want to take a broad approach. We want to discuss all 40 years after the war, talking about resistance, and starting point in the discussion will be the discussion on what the resistance, physical or resistance was. So who the guests are actually? We have outstanding speakers. We have Madam Małgorzata Choma-Jusińska, one of the famous experts dealing with the opposition in Poland in the 70s and 80s. Good morning, madam. I would like to welcome Dr. Tomasz Kozłowski, who dealt with the topic of the peasant solidarity in the 80s, and he's also making research on the transformation of the 80s in Poland. Welcome, sir. And we also have Professor Janusz Wrona, whose research actually initiated a new approach towards the Polish People's Republic period. Let me remind you his work on 1995 on the new notions that have been introduced, new narrative that was introduced back then, which is still actually valid. So professor is dealing with the political systems, the history of universities, the elites in the communist regime. So welcome, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, resistance against events after 1944. Yesterday, we discussed the difference between the resistance and adaptation. Professor Janusz Wrona often used this actually term, adaptation to the situation that happened after the end of the Second World War. When we talk about the adaptation of the community, we think about the society, we mainly think about actually the countryside. 80% of the population lived in the countryside, and this social scheme did not actually change after the war. So now I'm thinking, what in 1944, what the countryside was actually resisting against. And well, 8th of September 1944, agrar reform. Those who did not actually own land finally were supposed to get the land. Yesterday, I proposed actually the topic of certain moral responsibility for receiving land, because in fact this was the land that was taken away from other people, from the gentry, from the aristocracy, from the upper class of the society. So the question is whether the peasants actually identified themselves with the gentry and with that order where the peasants were working in the land that was owned by other people, by gentry. So in 1944, what the peasants were actually resisting against? There was a domination of the peasants and labor force actually forced. There was this disproportion, historical disproportions, social disproportions, disadvantaged groups neglected before. So the peasants after 1944 until 1956, did they really have anything to be to resist against? And how potentially we can fit their attitudes in the context of the underground activities, how this social background and social situation, logistics actually was organized. Countryside was the reservoir of food and other important products. How was it used? So, Professor, over to you. Let me start by saying that I am someone who really researched the source of all these events. I'm also actually researching the course of the history. Why? Because both my parents actually, they come from the countryside. Their parents actually were farmers. When I was a young boy, I spent a lot of time in the countryside. I was actually interested in history, so with my both fathers, I discussed a lot. And I remember these discussions very well. Often opinions expressed back then, they were, well, sometimes shocking. Education actually, school education did not actually discuss all these aspects a lot, and only when I got actually the information from the source, it turned out to be quite shocking. So the question is actually how the countryside actually responded towards the communist regime. Yesterday, one of the speakers said that, or mentioned something that I perfectly know actually from the narrative of my grandfather. The Red Army, namely, actually, who was crossing the well, Polish land. So from July to June to January, this actually they left Poland in January 1945. A few million soldiers who were mainly accommodated in the countryside. So I was often actually told how it looked like when it came to, the daily life of a family that had to share actually their home with Red Army, with the soldiers. So there was this interaction actually on this brink. So I was actually, my grandfather was born in 1900s actually. He always used to say, I graduated actually 7 classes of the primary school of the Russian school. So Russian language was a natural language, so there was a natural interaction actually with the Soviet soldiers. However, as I said, they were somehow managed. I remember first in the 60s, I heard about some blue controls. This blue color was actually typical for the officers of NKWD. So the system and collectivization such, as my grandfather actually was telling me, the most horrific things actually happened in Ukraine. We remember that until 1944, the mentality was totally different. What actually magazine was most popular in the countryside? That's quite interesting as well. I don't remember the name correctly right now. I can't recall it. Well, what was it? That was actually the magazine published in the place called Niepokalano. So it was quite a large edition. The cost of such magazine was 3 groszy. And once I really actually I had a look at this magazine, and I was quite actually shocked how many articles actually referred to the situation and farming system actually in the Soviet Union. So the collectivization actually already in 1944 was quite actually deeply rooted and embedded in the spirit of the Polish peasant back then. I remember when we discussed actually with the Soviet soldiers, they always told us the same would happen here. I remember actually some people tend to say that communists actually were denying in the beginning that collectivization would not happen, but peasants were afraid of that. So 1948 was not a surprise. So basically, you know, they were ready psychologically, mentally. They, of course, actually collectivization meant for them loss of the ownership, private ownership of land. So that was the basic aspect that was dominant in the attitudes of countryside towards the new regime, new authorities, until 1956, as I said. So moving away from the collectivization by Gomułka in 1956 led to certain stability in the countryside when it comes to attitude towards authorities. That's quite controversial aspect. The countryside then became practically until 1980s became a certain support for the communist authorities. Scale of resistance was quite limited vis-a-vis the resistance in the cities. There was yet another important element to be mentioned here. In educational revolution, yes, indeed, it actually happened in the Polish People's Republic times. The possibility of the promotion of peasants' children, and let's bear in mind that the countryside population amounted to 70%, they got the possibility of education. In the 40s, in the 50s, the communists used some social techniques. They were taking kids from the countryside to create certain generation of young people supporting the system, supporting regime. Yes, but it would solve two problems. The countryside was overpopulated back then, therefore not all people would be anyway able to stay there. It was a natural need to leave the countryside and to be promoted, socially promoted. I remember my mom told me that her father wanted her to push her away from the countryside, to move her to the city to get education. So that was quite a dominant aspect in the Polish countryside. Let me ask the question. Your mother, a woman, maybe for a woman that was the question of the true promotion and change of the professional life, because men not necessarily actually were the countryside men combined or associated the fact of living countryside with some social promotion. Education did not mean for them social promotion. My mom left the countryside in 1946. First, she got some training. She got a job in the office. And when I talked to her, she told me she was never interested in the career of a farmer's wife. It was very hard life. Always the education was supported in our family, and my mother always wanted actually to leave countryside. So women were specifically ready to leave countryside. This is just an example demonstrating that communism gave the opportunity for this social promotion through educational revolution. It's not only the question of the first years. As a historian, I was visiting countryside, I talked to people and I asked them, how was it in the 70s and in the 80s? People complained about communist regime, but at the same time they were admitting they gave the chance for the promotion of peasants' children, farmers' children, social promotion. I don't know if you remember, there were some points for your family background. You got these points by trying to get your place at the university. I was always against it. At the same time, the countryside, the population in Poland accepted it. Naturally, it was a kind of balancing of the background. So many young people coming from the countryside, thanks to these extra points, they managed to study, to get higher education. But there was a problem of this ownership of land. So collectivization should be understood in these categories. I always say we do not appreciate certain things. We talk about June in Poznan, we talk about revolt among blue collars, but the first rebellion was actually the rebellion of the farmers. It was a mass revolt where 500,000 peasants were repressed, underwent some repressions. That was the revolt against the collectivization. I remember that party members really treated it as ideological failure. They did not manage to go to implement something that was supposed to be the foundation of the system. However, it was confirmed by some other documents, the protocols on the, from the discussions in the 70s, 60s, or 80s when our authorities were visiting Moscow. There was always this topic, why the Polish countryside was not collectivized. So that was something that Moscow did not like. Gomułka was very stubborn. He understood the scale of the support and importance of this support from the countryside. Of course, a very important element was the Catholic Church, which definitely defended the values such as the ownership of land.
Problem wsi i rolnictwa pojawia nieustannie, gdzie no, Gomułka, pamiętajmy, że po 1956 rozpoczynają się te tak zwana socjalizacja wsi, to znaczy chociażby kółka rolnicze, potem spółdzielnie kółek rolniczych i jak nasz prymas zwraca Gomułce uwagę, że wieś tego nie akceptuje, że traktuje to jako recydywę powrotu do kolektywizacji. I ostatni moment, żeby postawić ten problem własności ziemi. Proszę Państwa, w latach 80. to PSL walczy, to znaczy ZSL walczy o tak zwany chłopski zapis w Konstytucji. On ostatecznie bodajże w 83 się pojawia. Czyli chłopi chcieli mieć tą kropkę na D, potwierdzenie, mamy zagwarantowania konstytucyjnego własności ziemi. I ja powiedziałbym, to jest klucz i z tego klucza wynika właśnie opór wobec władzy komunistycznej. Ale też pamiętajmy o jednej rzeczy. Wieś zostaje spacyfikowana. To kiedyś profesor Janusz powiedział o tym, że Państwo chyba najlepiej wiecie, badania IPN-owskie pokazują, że potem skala kolaboracji wymuszonej, kolaboracji ludności wiejskiej z aparatem bezpieczeństwa była bardzo duża. Ja też mam tu takie prace.
Was very big. This shows there were 10, 20, 30 people that were reporting on him from his environment. Well, this was forced because the scale of repression against the countryside was huge. It started in 1945, it lasted up to 1947. So I believe that the countryside was pacified politically. They were afraid of the oppressive authority. After 1956, just like the society started to be less afraid of this authority, or within the adaptation to the system, they got used to it. Also, the countryside had a smaller resistance or incidental. But in political terms, it existed when there was PSL and the hope that Mikołajczyk would win the elections, although after the referendum in June, it went down. But the failure of Mikołajczyk in 1947 resulted in the fact that a peasant has the capability of adaptation. I realized after talking to my grandfather, these conversations took a long, long time. 5 kilometers by horse, we would go to the field and we would talk. And I remember that we talked politics, that there is no way to do anything with the Russians. This is a power, and we have to adapt ourselves. So the issue of adaptation was very clear. So this is all insofar as my reflections. I don't want to prolong insofar as these problems related to the nuanced approach of the countryside. Of course, there is a... I'm sorry, there are interruptions. New approach, please believe me. My grandfather was in the home army in a municipality post. He was the commander. And I was asking him because we remember the official handbooks or textbooks in the 60s and 70s, what they wrote about these bandits. So I was asking him what was the position in support of independence. Well, it was very nuanced. The opinion I've heard at the time is that in reality, there were a lot of people who didn't care about patriotism, patriotic feelings. So there were various actions that didn't bring any honor. And I'm not saying it about my grandfather either. Later in the 90s, I had the possibility to talk about other people. Different materials in the Institute of National Remembrance. For sure, it wasn't black and white. I understand if there was a campaign of the underground that touched the entire community. A family who was murdered, someone who had family, children. Therefore, I would say these small things were decisive for support or unwillingness. I'm wondering, given personal issues, some relationships or family ties meant that someone was supporting the underground. I can assume that for the same reasons, the family could identify themselves with that internal bureau, because someone worked there and had profits from that. So there is all this pragmatism, peasants' pragmatism, and there is this mentality. There is this element of the pragmatic adaptation to the surrounding reality. But one more question, maybe a reflection, because I'm wondering if in 1945 and the following years, because this is the same generation, do they remember anything about 1920, 1920, 1919? About those committees, about taking away the land on one hand, and on the second hand, what was happening with the peasants when the Polish state was returning to the lost territories. There was very big penalty for the treason of the homeland, including the death penalty. In the interwar period, everyone knew perfectly what is happening in the East, what is communism, what is collectivization, and what does it mean in the Ukraine. But if I would say that in 1930, over 10% of the society were illiterate people, and when I look at the availability of press, when I track the press market and the titles that had the greatest number of how much press there was, so it's difficult to believe that this society was infused by knowledge about what is happening around them. For sure, this is about the 30s and the geopolitics, and that there might be a war. Were people interested in what was happening? I have doubts. So the question is, was there a question mark about anything being repeated? But this would be an assumption that they knew what was happening before. So this is about the awareness of the peasants. Were they aware? When you asked about 1920 and 1919, I remember both my grandparents who went to the military and were fighting. One of the grandparents was captured by the Bolsheviks. And after half a year, after signing these understandings, he was released. So he didn't considered it to be very traumatic. And quite important was that he knew Russian, that he was able to communicate.
To, o czym wspomniałeś, to pewna...
But what you've mentioned is building peasants' awareness. So the Red Army, several million people, the interactions, at least half a year interactions that were unavoidable. They showed what awaits us or what awaits the countryside, what is the perspective. But you mean the accounts from the Second World War, not the Polish Bolshevik War, Polish-Russian War. Well, insofar as Podlasie or other areas, I didn't encounter such accounts about some revolutionary action. There's one element in all these accounts that I remember from that period, the anti-Semitic, we would call it today, especially after the Second World War. This does appear, that people say that these were Jews. Remember, these were Jews. Their names given. Those who came, of course, because it didn't survive. This anti-Semitism is interesting, it's verbalized. Because I was asking, did anyone survive Holocaust? And someone told me that was a woman who married a Pole and she was excluded from the Jewish community. Everyone knew that she was Jew and nobody betrayed her. She didn't hide herself, but Germans didn't know about it. So there were no informants about it. Nobody informed on her. So this element existed.
Ten stereotyp, że do komuny się kształtował i to był widoczny na wsi. To z relacji pamiętam. Zresztą nie tylko ja, bo potem w takich pracach
I remember this from the accounts, and I see it among the students. They talk about their grandparents, great-grandparents. Therefore, I have a question to you, because we are talking about this resistance, physical and institutional oppositions against the state as such. But what is happening in Poland after the end of the Second World War, the great or the grand social project, which was supposed to bring transformation in many segments of life, starting with everyday life, the mentality, religiousness, traditions, everything which forms a human being culturally, socially, psychologically. So I'm wondering how much in this area, once the system becomes stable after 1947, how much there is a resistance in this community. Do these people really accept the new format, which is supposed to be imposed on them or presented to them? And several themes relate to that, insofar as resistance, understood in various ways, because internal immigration, this is also a resistance, accepting that there is the official world and my private life. Wrona spoke a few times about this educational boom. And I had to deal with it also a few times. This is about the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, insofar as this mechanical pushing of rural population to school and higher education. The authorities failed here from the very beginning, and the academic work that, well, we weren't able to replace it, to change it into something new. They were not interested in people who were not interested in education. So the rural population didn't want to get educated. We've talked about it yesterday, that it was not worth it for them, maybe except of women who, by educating themselves and going to the cities, increase their social and financial status. So they changed their circumstances from all points of view. You said that your mother didn't want to be a wife of a farmer. Yes. So when I also asked questions about the resistance against the social cultural transformation, I remember my mother, who originated from one of the villages near Lublin. Nowadays it's a part of Lublin, but it used to be a village, and she was ostracized in a strange way. Her mother and her siblings was very proud that she's the only one going to the city, going to study. This was a reason to be proud, but only in their house, in their home. But for all the community, this was a type, or maybe not a betrayal of the community, but some negative approach, that this is a waste. She's gonna go and have a family over there, will not have contact with the family, will lose contact with the community because she'll start a family in the city. Maybe some jealousy because she was the best student in primary school, but the countryside was resisting. When I was talking to people who was responsible for her education, they know till today that they have to say that it was important, that they were fighting in the wars. Finally, there was this civilizational progress, but the people, they were not interested. The state proposed the new relationships between men and women. Did these women in the countryside want to participate in something similar? So, institutionally, the state promoted the equality between women and men.
I tak nie były w stanie wyjść poza narzucone wcześniej kulturowo role społeczne, to znaczy matki i żony. Nie wspierał, państwo wspierało to tylko formalnie, na kościół tego, jak
the state was formally supporting it, and the church did not support it in a broader practical dimension. Did peasants resist against the new ethos of work? This new ethos of work was related to the work for the state. When I read about the relations between the peasants and the gentry before the 30s, that idea of the peasant was to pretend to work because the gentry was exploiting them and not paying fair prices. So the peasant did not naturally, in the genotype, followed the mentality of importance of work, building the social status. Work was used to get richer, to have better comfort of life. Didn't peasants resist against that? And finally, the social political life, daily life. Somebody was the first secretary in the community. Someone was responsible to organize equipment, not even mentioning some basic products. Didn't peasants resist against the state that declared huge slogans? At the same time, reality was totally different. Maybe you can find different areas, other areas of resistance against social and cultural changes. And coming to an end of my lengthy question, but I wanted to outline the perspective, I recall the relation that sometimes come across my mind about the person who came to the city in the beginning of the 60s. So he rented a room. He was coming from the countryside. from one of the provinces, and he, in the rented room, he noticed actually there was a bed that you were able to open. There was a duvet inside and a pillow, and he thought that was a place to sleep. So in this box he laid down and closed the bed, and actually he believed that was the place to sleep. He didn't actually use all the tools delivered, provided. So people from the countryside, even coming to the city, they did not use the amenities like beds. They slept on the floor, as they didn't know such amenities. So who would like to discuss this topic? I don't want to monopolize this discussion, so I'm waiting for others to join us, but I think you are talking about incidental case. However, I do agree with one thing. When we talk about the education, for instance, I'm going to get back to this issue all the time. The only individuals got good education, but the countryside was the foundation of the social structure. So even though we have the situation that in the family we have several kids and only one becomes a student, in the mass scale, there is a process initiated a process of countryside moving to the city. It was a natural selection. It's like today, not everyone wants to get the education. There are individuals who have ambition to get education. However, back then, the education was available. There was there were student houses available. New individuals were shaped in this new reality. New individuals that were supposed to support the authorities. However, the economic barrier that specifically after 1989 appeared. Barrier in education, economic barrier that did not all people allow actually to pursue education. Back then, in the past, this barrier did not exist. Yet another important element that we have to remind all the time, the question of relationship, family relationships in the countryside. Because today we talk issues related to safety, security. In the documents, however, you can find interesting reports. It was important that Mr. X was my cousin, and the fact that he belonged to the party was a secondary issue. The loyalty mainly related to the family. So I do remember at the political bureau level, actually, in materials we see that the control over the countryside was lost, somehow diluted. The authorities, because the loyalty was stronger vis-a-vis the family members than vis-a-vis the party members. So that was a problem for those who wanted to reshape the reality, but it also enabled the process of adaptation. It's like, later on, many things could have been actually managed and solved in 70s and 80s, because if you had a cousin in a cooperative, then you were able to get somehow the products, foodstuffs, etc. So it somehow loosened the whole system. So there was also the party system in the countryside, and this system was also somehow based on these family relationships. Well, I was trying actually to ask the following question. Was there any formula, or the peasants that adapted to this, pragmatically adapted to the situation? Was it the social basis for the revolutionary movement or social movement starting in the 70s? Anyone who got involved in the opposition activity, any organizers, these were people actually coming from the country. did they consider countryside as a kind of foundation for the resistance? Because when we read about the December 70, Radom 76, Solidarity, it's a separate topic. These are all about the revolts of blue collars. However, these blue collars come from a certain background, so hard to believe that these are blue collars who, like in 1905, lived in the cities only. Now we have blue collars with a specific background. So this plot of looking for the support of the countryside people appeared in the among the intellectual leaders of the opposition. Did they think about including the peasants in this anti-systemic resistance in a situation when we can assume there was a popular belief that it was quite comfy life in the countryside? Bear in mind that in the 1970s, good life was just belonging to a certain canon of pop culture. Sami Swoi movie, the second and the third series, strengthened the propaganda image of the peasants population, countryside population who lived in the beautiful Poland, in the sunny countryside in Poland. So what do you think about this? Were the peasants important in the process of opposition, or oppositionists who built this movement from the 70s, didn't they feel actually a certain resistance against people who could have been blamed of pragmatism, supporting the authorities and people at power? And did opposition members and leaders remember their background, because they probably also came from the country? Let me get back first to the first issue that we discussed already, because it was broadly discussed yesterday and today. Many interventions were concluded with the statement of the pragmatism of people of countryside population and the ability to adapt to the system. It looks like, despite the trauma of collectivization, destruction of PSL, the Peasants' Party, when in the 1956 there was this potential possibility to fight for a certain scope of more liberal and free activity, since then we can see that in this people's movement related in terms of ideas and programs related to the countryside, there were certain processes of involvement initiated. People were trying actually to find a space for their own activity. I think it's well visible as of October 1956 until 1958. In these rural areas, in these small rural centers, rural small villages, there were these local structures of Zbowet or ZSL, so the People's Parties. So you can see these personal movements when on the wave of October, new people come, people who were related to PSL after war, underground soldiers from the war times and after war, so post-war period. And in this first period of October, they constitute the group that dominate the local structures of Zbowet or ZSL. So their activity is followed by a verbalized message saying that we should get back independence of the people's movement. So when there is such an option coming, then these people's communities, peasants, politically involved, undertake this challenge. After 1958, these possibilities were blocked, not possible, not available anymore. But 1956, 1958, this short period proves and demonstrate the potential of the communities coming from PSL. So the rural communities ready for the political engagement within the framework created by that times. When it comes to the emancipation, I believe that emancipation of rural women was supported by certain factors independent from the authorities. War times and post-war times, we see that the situation and role of women changed. Women became breadwinners for the families. Situation forced them actually to maintain their families. And this aware politics of the state, favoring actually migration from the countryside to the city, only strengthened such a process vis-a-vis young women.
There are those there is this research by newspaper Przyjaciółka, and there was a special edition of Przyjaciółka for rural communities. There was different contents, different language compared to the one that was for the city dwellers. So it would be worth it to look at this problem more broadly. So it's I'm sorry, I want to interrupt you for a moment because this is a very important subject that you're tackling, but I'm wondering how much the authorities were able to follow the processes that you're discussing. I just actually scanned and read all Przyjaciółka and all women's press from the 50s. I would like to use it more in the future, but it's true that there are some segments or additions for the ladies living in the countryside. But insofar as the subject matter tackled there, it's of course how to make something out of nothing, like nice clothes or furniture. And there's some advice regarding food, nutrition, and cooking. And I'm wondering if it's not a proof of that, yeah, that it was a certain direction, but the authorities couldn't keep up with those needs. I think that it's that in the center they created politics, and the implementation of that policy, if we're talking about the editors of a newspaper, of a magazine, or organizations that were dedicated to women, or for instance the entire service or the farming advice that dealt not only with economic things related to farming, that there is a segment also dedicated to women and to taking care of the household. I think that the needs, well, it's difficult to find something in common in many phenomena because there was a different level of development in different areas of Poland, different level, civilizational level. We just talked about the lack of basic knowledge about everyday life and the capability of using equipment or furniture, but not everyone had this problem. Not in all cases we can talk about this civilizational backwardness. So I think that insofar as Przyjaciółka magazine and other writings on quite basic level, like encouraging for education, this is an average level, but of course the needs of rural community, of women in the countryside were diversified, but the fact that there was this countryside mutation of magazine for women, it proved that there was such a policy and that they appreciate the direction of such activities. Małgorzata, and the countryside as the background of the first opposition movements, the things that I've asked about at the beginning. I'm gonna repeat once again. No, I remember. I remember this question. Villages, the countryside, rural areas were quite peculiar insofar as the character, the nature of farmers' work and their experiences from previous years with their mentality.
Chcesz powiedzieć, że chłopi nie mieli czasu na to, żeby
You'd
angażować.
like to say that peasants didn't have time to get involved in opposition to activities? Yeah, not fully. I think that this was a group dependent in a very particular way from various institutions with which they had to cooperate. So they had to be pragmatic, they had to be very careful, and they would rebel once they believed that their interests are threatened. And there were quite a bit of these revolts because of political and religious reasons. So if we were to track this entire period after 1956 even, it turns out that there are a lot of crisis situations in the countryside. The process of the introduction of socialist relations in the countryside, like cooperatives and farming, cooperative farming, it didn't end. There were many ideas. There were those clubs, for instance, and other forms. So the protest did appear locally throughout the entire period after 1956. So the countryside wasn't completely passive, but farmers had their own interests, pragmatic interests. This is how I would describe it. But it seems to me, well, that we should be aware of the fact that in the second half of the 70s, once open opposition appeared also in intelligentsia circles, these were not big groups of opposition activists, right? So proportionally, it seems to me that the engagement of rural dwellers from 77, 76, so being engaged in the opposition. So the committees of peasant self-defense or the independent trade union of farmers created by an important figure for development of opposition in the countryside. We're jumping from one subject to another a little bit now, but yesterday there's continuity of certain biographies did appear. It's worth to mention Henryk Bąk from Lisewo, the former Radomskie province, Radom province, who was about 1950 the creator of a secret organization created in protest against collectivization. He was condemned to death and then put in prison, but once he left prison, he was still engaged, living in Warsaw, he was engaged in the activities and rural activities, so around Lisewo, and in 70s he was the co-creator of one of independent farming organizations. And in the 80s, and we'll be talking about the 80s soon, he was an activist of rural Solidarność. So this is an example of such engagement, of such commitment. There are not many such biographies and people who are engaged to this extent, but among the people who were engaged in rural areas in this activity, there are several who were, for example, underground soldiers after the war. During the war, they were in the home army, and in the 70s, so later, they were engaged in the activity of the opposition. Or after the war, they were activists of PSL, and 70s or 80s, these were these different peasants' committees or Solidarność trade union. Mr. Kozłowski, I think that this is worth to pay attention to two aspects. First of all, in the second half of the 70s, what appears is a certain basis for the creation of various opposition organizations in the countryside, which results from deteriorating economic situation simply. Besides that, we have the effect of this balance where the crew of Gierek, after gaining power, decides to go for consumptionism, enticing people to consumptionism, introducing living on credit, and after the initial improvement of life, remuneration, work, in the second half of the 70s, we have a drop, and the countryside can feel it just as well as the cities. In the middle of the 70s, there are attempts to introduce certain solutions in the countryside that are non-beneficial for the individual farming, like the new act of law about the pensions, or equipping farmers in different production stuff, equipment. So production means, so farmers have their own interest in expressing their disillusionment insofar as certain solutions introduced by the authorities. And the second thing, just to simplify it, in the cities, there is democratic opposition starting to be formed. Starting in 1976, this is really growing fast. So there are two issues. Some of these organizations, like the Committee of Defense of the Workers and the Movement of the Defense of Human Rights and Citizens' Rights, had the idea in subsequent years to carry an activity which will have the effect of creating independent organization in various social groups. There will be independent leaders emerging who will be creating the start of social movements in their groups. This is why we have the KOR, the Committee of Defense of the Workers. This is obvious. They support the workers from the very beginning, and they create certain means, and afterwards supports the opposition and student groups, so supports the SKS. And the element of the strategy is also supporting and animating certain movements in the countryside. And this is a very important element, because we have to state it clearly. Logistic capabilities of functioning of the opposition in the cities are much better than in the countryside. In the cities, the opposition was able to organize at least a partially conspirational structures dealing with print or carrying out some collections and and they also had contact with West and forwarded information that was very important. Information about various types of activities, appeals, requests, but also repressions was sent to the West, and then with the ways of the Radio Free Europe, for instance, would come back, would return to Poland, and that was like a protection umbrella for that opposition as well. So these are two important elements where city opposition or urban opposition supports the countryside opposition or rural opposition. So on one hand, it supports or takes over fully of the task of printing different types of brochure, leaflets, or independent press for rural community, targeted at rural community and concentrated on the problems of life in the countryside. And on the other hand, it takes care of the information about this activity, about the request of the opposition rural groups and repressions would be presented on the radio, Free Europe radio. So it would be covered by this protection umbrella. But we have to also say that, for example, the security service was decided and undertook a lot of steps, quite decisive steps, against the opposition activists in the countryside? I don't know. Well, we can only suppose, but it seems to me that the opposition was not strong enough. So if it wouldn't be for the support of urban opposition and the creation of Solidarność Trade Union in 1980, this activity in the countryside, in rural areas, would be shut off. So I have a question. Adding to what Dr. Kozłowski has said, the first segment is quite naive, but I would like to compare my naivete with the specialists. If it's this, as you say, that rural populations, peasants or farmers, we were wondering at a certain moment, because these names do change, get engaged in some activity contesting the state because their living standards go down. So how we can connect it all with such people as Wyszyński or Wojtyła, who talks so strongly about a certain religiousness, therefore a certain group of recipients. So this is 1 and 2. So let's go to the beginning of the 80s, Solidarność of individual farmers. What type of a movement it is? Is it a mass movement? What are the relationships between this Solidarność and the remaining Solidarność at the very beginning?
I wreszcie jak PZPR podchodzi do tej solidarności rolników? Czy można mówić?
And finally, what was the attitude of PZPR vis-a-vis farmers? Can we say about the diversification of attitudes? First question related to the religion, religiousness, and Catholic Church's attitude vis-a-vis countryside and opposition specifically. We have to say openly that these things do not exclude one another, and the questions that, well, the fact that there are some social motivation does not exclude the issue of religion and religiousness. So it is not surprising in the case of blue collar populations, there was this revolt aimed at getting more money, get better salaries, and improving of the social life. And the dominant language there, specifically at the seaside, is just actually the exposition of the religiousness, searching for support in church, and asking the priests and clergy to organize Holy Mass and services during the strikes. So these are these trends and tendencies that actually happen next to each other, and there is even a kind of synergy effect happening. So we have strikes in July and October 1980, and then in September Solidarity movement is born, and it will be then registered in November. And definitely this is an inspiration for the countryside population to fight for their rights. This is the inspiration for the whole society as such, and everyone looks at solidarity and trade unions, even the groups that theoretically under normal circumstances in a democratic state would not actually organize trade unions, such as students. In the beginning of the 80s, they were saying they were not establishing the independent students movement as the movement for students, but as a trade union that has guaranteed right for strikes. So the farmers also look at this model, and this model is supported by the society, broadly supported. If we look at the autumn 1980, the public opinion polls, 89% of the respondents support the fact that farmers establish their own trade unions. This is immediately after signing the agreement from the August agreement, this was the next step. Of course, this support will drop over time, but now we are in 1989. The inspiration by solidarity is huge, a huge support of the society to establish trade unions in the countryside. We have a certain foundation in the form of the opposition organizations that functioned in the second half of the 70s. There was a work done on the concept of the trade unions. That was the work done by Henryk Bong, and there is a movement of the trade union, well, the establishing trade unions. It's much weaker than the urban solidarity movement. It results from few elements. First of all, as we said, logistics base is much poorer here. So the solidarity that is organized in the huge factories that have access to telex, to paper, to printers, copy machines, the solidarity that have efficient tools to push the authorities, like strike in the factory. All this actually does not exist in the countryside. There is no logistics background in the countryside, and farmers cannot effectively go on strike because there is no factory to organize the striking. So this resistance is much weaker, and the authorities exert pressure to slow down development of the trade unions among farmers. The whole movement is divided. Also, there is no specific center that we have seen in 1980s in Gdańsk, MKZ, which 21 postulates and the agreements, arrangements signed become the model and the symbol for the whole country. Well, the farmers don't have it. They don't have their strike. They don't have such center. There are 3 organizations established: rural solidarity, peasant solidarity, and agricultural productions movement, producer movement. So they are not very popular. They are not that popular. Of course, in the 80s, Wałęsa was perceived as a leader of the strikes and such solidarity movement in the cities. In the countryside, we do not have such person, such personality. So this movement in the countryside is more scattered, and it's fragmented, and it's much less numerous. In the beginning of the 1989, we don't know what the estimates, what are the estimates of PZPR based on the regional survey. It is estimated that in autumn approximately 30,000 people countrywide is engaged in the peasants movement. In autumn 1980, the solidarity in the city had millions of members. In October, they were able to organize the strike that mobilized 1.2 million people. So, compared with that, against that, the solidarity in the countryside was much, much weaker. That was changing already in 1981. However, this movement was always weaker than the blue-collar movement. So we have problems to estimate the headcount of the countryside solidarity movements due to the fact that there was a problem to verify and analyze the true membership of the farmers in this movement. The authorities in 1981 estimated that the farmers' solidarity amounted to 600,000 people. The farmers, Jan Kuwarek, who became the leader in 1981, he said he mentioned something like 2 million, but the realistic estimates that we may say, we may give you this. So the problem among the individual farmers is the problem of the headcount and the commitment. So this solidarity movement was not able to impact the power, the authorities. They were not able to fight for their postulates. They are much weaker than and the solidarity in the cities. There was yet another factor, positive factor, as we said in the past. Before this countryside movement, they enjoyed a lot of support from the church, and Wyszyński for many times appealed, and he distributed the message during informal discussions, exchange of information with the party members. He expressed that he supported the trade unions, and he demanded actually their legalization. So that was the positive factor, and the negative factor was that the solidarity movement among the farmers was triggering a lot of threats in Kremlin. So the fact that collectivization in Poland failed, and that was least efficient, least effective collectivization in the whole Soviet bloc among the Soviet bloc countries, so that Poland was really differing from other countries. The fact that in the post-war period there was a strong PSL party, so this all made Moscow be very reluctant against the Polish or vis-a-vis the Polish countryside. So there is this accumulation of a few factors. In Poland, we had individual farmers. On top of that, we had the situation where individual farmers get organized in something that was perceived by Moscow as anti-socialistic initiative. So that was actually the way how the trade unions were organized in the countryside. They were these factors, advantages and disadvantages of the whole situation, and the farmers until half of 1981 were waiting for their farming organization to be registered. Anyone else who would like to add anything to that? If I may, for the first part about church, we have to remember that we have the notion of the people's religiousness, this aware politics, and the form of cult was actually adapted to the level of perception of rural population, and that's why we had this Maria cult strongly rooted in the countryside.
Postępu cywilizacyjnego. Między innymi
So something that was somehow combined with this traditional progress in the role of women. In the past, I was studying what Wyszyński was saying. In his preachers, he was saying, why you want to go to the city? Why you want to be there? You should stay here. You should, there was also this traditional cult of the family. And the parish was deeply rooted in the mentality of the rural population. The social function was really very important. So from the perspective of the authorities in this society, the person was always a guru of such local authority, community, and the church was very important. The role of the church was really huge and crucial. So I remember actually the question of solidarity and the attitude of the primate towards trade unions. There was a certain level of skepticism. Why? Because the primate did not want actually that the control over trade union is taken over by people who potentially would be able to use them for their own objectives interests, people who were not related to church. So that's why at a certain stage he was skeptical about it. But once he realized that such control and influence of the church will be quite crucial, as previous speaker said, there was a big enthusiasm actually and support for creation and establishment of trade unions. So the role in the of the church in the social life was really very, very big, and the role of the parish in the local community, the social role was also actually quite not to be underestimated. So the leaders in the rural communities and the church, this was very important to shape the organized resistance that was really strong. So that these were not individual gestures, acts, deeds of individuals. So the history of the 70s demonstrates it the best. Committee of the resistance was the committee led by priest Sadłowski. That was the self-help, peasant self-help committee. That was the episode of the lengthy history of this active, socially active society, active in various dimensions, and Priest Sadłowski was always assisting their parish, supporting them not only in this religious dimension, he was also helping to organize various, to satisfy various needs.
There are situations, conflict situations that might provoke rebellion. Already in the 70s, based on what I've observed, the inhabitants of the countryside search for the support of the priest. This is their initiative. And besides priest Sadłowski, there is the Przemyśl Bishop Ignacy Tokarczuk, right, who's help for rural communities and for various opposition communities in general that search for support from him cannot be overestimated. And rural leaders, these communities that had the leader but non-conflicting, whose ambitions wouldn't clash with the ambitions of other people, these communities, well, it seems that in their activity they were stronger and more effective. And the resistance, or rather the organized activity of rural communities in the 70s and 80s was based on the cooperation with the opposition, as Mr. Kozłowski has said, with various opposition communities, or with Workers' Solidarność, which was the necessary support for the rural communities. I just want to add one thing. If we're talking about the church and the possible impact of cooperation, I think this is one of the most important factors differentiating the urban Solidarność from the rural one. Looking at it from the political point of view and relating to what Professor Wrona was speaking about, Wyszyński at the beginning in summer and autumn 1980 was afraid of the strikes, that they would go, that they would lose control and that there would be Soviet intervention. Then he was afraid that non-controlled trade union activity, the escalation of demands would lead to the same situation. And he, of course, undertakes certain measures and he's distrustful, and it can be quickly changed because the key advisors of the rural association are the people who are related to the church, Professor Piątkowski, Professor Głowicz. So Wyszyński is convinced that he is able to influence the political direction of this trade union, and he's calm. He knows that there won't be any escalation of tensions happening. So, besides that, he has some political influence partially. The second issue is that after the introduction of the martial law, Solidarność and opposition in the countryside is fully based on the church. In case of rural Solidarność, there is the cooperation of some of the priests. The churches are the places of independent meetings, some artistic initiatives, but there is also some space for the functioning of the opposition outside of the church. But what is happening after 1981 in the countryside, all these activities, attempts at reanimating rural Solidarność, illegal underground, are fully based on the support of the church. Well, I want to ask about one more thing and another theme. How Solidarność and these activists went through the martial law. Did the state institutionally try to get control back over these groups? I remember I found a statement by Wojciech Jaruzelski in 1984 when he was quite defeatist, saying, well, it seems that we didn't manage to build socialism because we didn't manage to win rural communities. So what it looks like after the martial law? Is the state trying to take over control, going back to the pragmatism, financial support, loans? This is all happening in the 80s, insofar as these people. Who would like to comment on that? I just want to comment. The policy of the party towards the countryside is influenced much more by the church and not the ZSL. So whatever the primate says is very important from the point of view of decisions taken by the rural community, because this is not fully solved by us. Where is ZSL in all of that? What does this movement look like in the 80s during the martial law and after? And is the state trying to regain initiative? I would like to pay attention to things. Professor Wrona already said it, that there was a huge influence of the church. And the second thing is something that results from polls, public opinion polls that I've read, that people living in the countryside or farmers were much less interested in politics in general and in the activities of the opposition in particular. When the authorities are trying to diagnose in the 80s the scale of support for Solidarność trade union or various opposition initiatives, political reforms, more far-reaching, like the preparations to the round table, etc., the polls show that farmers were the group who was least interested in the entire process. At the very end of this range were educated workers. So this is quite an important thing that shapes the background of what is happening in the countryside. If I may interrupt, could we therefore state that the transformation is happening somehow next to the farmers? In a sense, yes, but let's not forget that there was a representation of Solidarity Trade Union, individual farmers Solidarity Trade Union present throughout this entire process of the roundtable, or later when there were preparations to carry out partially free elections. The activists of the individual farmers were the activists next to Lech Wałęsa of a committee. They were on the lists of Solidarność election lists in May or June 1989, and they were constituting one of the important elements of this movement. This broke in a sense and changed after the creation of the government of Tadeusz Mazowiecki, which was established based on the coalition of ZSL, if we take ZSL as a coalitionist, this will push away the activists of the Solidarność of individual farmers, and the first clashes, the first secessions in the civic parliamentary club. These are the people from the rural communities, actually. So this is one issue, and the second one, insofar as the functioning in the 80s or after the martial law, the issue is, first of all, the Solidarność of individual farmers do not enter the martial law. At the moment of the introduction of martial law, they are not in a good condition. After registering one union, I didn't talk about it. In 1981, in March, there's the unification of these three organizations that I've talked about. In May, they are registering the organization, and afterwards, immediately after being registered, after registering this trade union, there are all problems appearing that I've talked about. And there is, first of all, the deteriorating social support called the idea of farmers, trade unions. City dwellers were convinced that once that farming Solidarność will be created, the countryside will produce more food, everything will work more smoothly. But the second half of the 80s is a complete collapse of the food market and of the economic situation. So the support goes down. And also the urban Solidarność, urban solidarity trade union is steering away from the farmers. Lech Wałęsa says, well, we helped you to get registered, but you're a legal organization, you're just working for yourself. And he doesn't want to give further loans for the activity of Farmers Solidarity Trade Union. So this trade union is weakening in the second half of the 1981. Additionally, we have the martial law. We have over 300 activists who are put in prison, activists from the Farmers Solidarność. And Jan Kułaj is also interned, just like Wałęsa. Wałęsa and Kułaj are put in jail separately. They are in individual cells under the security surveillance, and the authorities start negotiations with them, hoping that they will create or recreate trade unions that we call Solidarność. So they wanted to recreate this solidarity, urban and rural solidarity, but among leaders, there would be people who would be secret cooperators, and they would be willing to compromise, to come to a compromise with the authorities, so we can control them in a sense. So although Wałęsa is actually not going forward in these negotiations, so he comes clean, Jan Kułaj actually is supporting the policy of Jaruzelski. So this is yet another reason for which this union is starting to collapse, because the person who's been considered a leader is standing on the side of people who introduced the martial law. So the weakening here is very strong. And the logistic issues, that security service is much stricter in rural communities compared to urban communities. So there are problems with organizations simply of the conspirational activity. You can only get support from the church or from urban opposition, but the situation doesn't allow to create real and actually a significant force in the countryside in the 80s. Anyone else would like to comment? I think that a very important subject is the problem of the leaders. Wałęsa Kułaj, who becomes a member of the consultation board as a leader of the opposition trade union. So undoubtedly the human factor was quite important for the leaders. So the role of the union was not as it could have been. It's worth to mention that in 1983, the farmers achieved what they were fighting for decades, so constitutionally guaranteed ownership of land and the possibility to inherit land. So I think that this could have had some impact on the mood, on the perception of that period. I think that we should pay attention to the fact that even more than in case of workers' trade union, when we are talking about the 80s, we talk about farmer solidarity and about the farmers. These are two collections that have that part in common. The activists of farmer solidarity, this is 600, 800,000, and there are many more farmers. Even if they support some motions, the scale of engagement was much smaller. In the 80s, these communities, the farmers' communities, were not divided politically very clearly, but maybe it should be said that if we analyze, if we talk about their approach to the authorities, about the direction of activities, we should pay attention to the fact that such people who had this temperament of an activist, social activist, when they were getting involved in the activity of Solidarność, underground Solidarność, and it was different from the farmers who were on the margin of this social activity. So just one question, could we say that among these people in the 80s, what was lacking in this ethics of a state person?
Or is it totally different category? I believe it's too far-reaching simplification. We have different levels of divisions. We have active division between rural areas and urban areas. We, society and authorities, and but you know, such actions, not in your own interest, but in the interest of something more abstract, like the good of the state. I believe that in the farmer's mentality, there is a certain element of egoism, this egoism or the focus on your own ownership, like farming, own farming, to have, not to be, as we said yesterday. But on the other hand, in the publications of the independent, rural independent actually publications in the 80s, 70s, there was this mentality presented saying that the farmers are the part of the nation, not even the society, but nation. They are citizens, they are breadwinners for the nation. So since 70s and 80s, when the farmers actually are demanding to get the equal position and rights, social rights with other social groups, because they are the breadwinners in the society. So they actually are the foundation for the state, functioning of the state. So it is, of course, rooted in a certain egoism of this social group. They believe they are important to satisfy the biological needs of the society. It's not only thinking about your own farm, it's a broader perspective, because there is actually the postulate and motion of the request of developing the self-government, local government. In certain service in the statement of the old members of the Solidarity, there was this element of dignity. You mentioned already the value of work and the ethos of work, ethos of labor of farmers. So this ethos of, or the element of the farmers' dignity also appeared in the 70s and the 80s. So it was not only about the fact that they wanted to have. It's the whole care for the quality of farming, and I believe that farmers actually were in difficult situation. The context of the surrounding put them in the more complex situation. The professor mentioned already about this family relationships, local relationships, and such networks were actually the source of corruption. It doesn't mean that farmers would love to function in such a system. They definitely would prefer to establish clear relations with the institutions that they must cooperate because they service the farming system. So indeed, in fact, it's a very complex issue. It's only a fragmented image, picture that we get, and how farmers and rural dwellers perceive a state, local society, hierarchy of values, my farm, my surrounding, my community, my nation. So I'm just thinking about the opposite perspective, how the urban dwellers actually perceived the problems with obtaining food from the countryside. Maybe they believed that farmers were trading in food. They blamed farmers for trading in food in the unofficial way. So just, thinking about this reversed relationship of a daily life in the 80s. So, but coming to conclusion, or my question is, so in election, June 1989, what was the approach of the countryside and how the countryside entered this first period of democratic state? So who's going to answer, who's going to take this? Not easy question, by the way. Dr. Kozłowski? Doctor, the floor is yours. I'm just thinking about it. As I said, in the 80s, 90s, there is actually a high level of the political apathy in the countryside. So I believe that getting ready for the election in June, that was not a breakthrough moment for the rural community. We are now entering a new discussion. What is a breakthrough moment? And undoubtedly, the breakthrough moment was the shape of the economic transformation. I believe that the fact that the countryside incurred high costs, not only individual farmers, but also state-owned farms who really suffered from the process of economic transformation. Well, I don't know the results of the survey, but I believe that the perception of the moment of transformation and breakthrough is not that rosy. Professor Wrona, honestly speaking, I did not analyze that problem. I rather focus on, or I agree with the fact that generally speaking, the countryside was quite was stuck in apathy. I don't think that they were somehow against or for the for the regime. So, but Professor Kozłowski mentioned one important fact. These people were left alone in these capitalistic relations where they did not know, they were not adapted to the reality. But we talk about June 1989, the election, and the question of the state-owned farms. This is a problem of Balcerowicz reform. So the process of the destruction of the state-owned farms, even later than 90s. So this does not impact that specific moment. But of course, later on, the post-state-owned farm population, that was these were the supporters of the leftists. So I believe there are first populistic movements, like Self-Defense Party. When Self-Defense Party was established, in which year, I don't remember honestly, but I believe that Andrzej Leper was trying to build some structures since 1990s, so that was pretty early, bearing in mind all the topics we discuss. Yes, very early indeed. There are some institutions of the Third Republic of Poland responsible for the security in the state. They were quite worried by establishment of some parties, including self-defense party established by Leper with some radical instigating some radical sentiments. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss attitudes of the rural population towards everything that happened after 1944. Professor, you wanted to ask you wanted to ask your question, right? Professor, you can ask your question now. I see you raised your hand. Maybe he's muted. Professor, you're muted.
Dobrze, teraz chyba mnie słychać.
Okay, I think I'm audible now. I wanted to refer to a few plots that appeared in the discussion, and I'm not talking about the question, I'm just, I would like to supplement on some aspects, if I may. We were talking about the resistance against collectivization. We discussed a bit this problem yesterday. However, ladies and gentlemen, the resistance against collectivization and the insufficient data that I get from the Ministry of the Public Security indicated that it was 500,000 farmers, peasants who were fined financially for the resistance. Recently asked the question how big the resistance was, the more spectacular resistance, like resistance of peasants against establishing the cooperatives. So when we take the Stalin period in consideration, the resistance, according to the proven data, information of the that comes from the Ministry of the Public Security, there were like 140 incidents of resistance. So where peasants were manifesting, attacking people working for cooperatives. Moreover, 1953, that was the year of the biggest number of such incidents. And there were like two regions in Lubelskie and Kieleckie the regions, the resistance was the biggest. Why there? Maybe some question of heritage, inheriting the land, maybe the local conditions were the strangest ones there. So that was my comment about the resistance. But let me remind you the resistance form that was not researched so far by historians. Maybe? Oh, I remember I once worked on the publication on the administrative reform in the beginning of 1970, 71, 72, and 3. So it was a huge peasants' resistance against the creation of new communes that deprived so far local authorities their positions. So the peasants who lost their seats and their locations actually were against or resisting against this new movement. So it triggered a lot of, it sparked a lot of tension in the countryside. In Poznański region, in some villages, and this is proven by documents, we had information that for pacification of this incidents, ZOMO was used. So it was quite a significant problem, was not actually well known in the history. So this resistance of the peasants against the new administrative order was quite important. So on top of these open incidents, we've had the attempts of impacting the reality through, for instance, sending delegates to bigger cities, Warsaw, where they had some local people posted some exercising some high position in the among the authorities. So this was quite typical for peasants of that years. Yet another problem that appeared here and Professor Wrona mentioned, that was this educational promotion and the points for the background, for the countryside background. That's right, but if we read some research on education from Polish People's Republic time, it turns out that young people coming from the countryside, they got their places at universities not because of the points for background they get. They were simply good. They were simply actually passing the exams at the satisfactory level, and they were accepted and enrolled. Well, I had a different vision of this problem. However, we have hard data coming from the research that proves this fact. Another aspect related to the ethos of peasants and new, well, blue collars with the countryside origins. In the 50s and 60s, the Polish blue collars class, under the influence of the peasants, really became more similar to peasantry, so they were demonstrating certain behaviors that were typical for the countryside. So for these people, for this group, everything they achieved in the cities was sufficient. That's what they wanted to have. So these were the most important elements I wanted to mention in this discussion. I'm not going to discuss other aspects that are less important here. We do not have time to discuss all this in details. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. And now over to our speakers.
If you give me 5 minutes, I made a lot of notes because this discussion was very interesting. I wanted to say, going back to the beginning, what came to my mind. We are used to approaching these things in a different way. The world have changed on the 11th of November. And if someone cooked soup on the 10th of November and was born in Poland on the 11th of November in independent Poland, the soup was the same. There was a certain continuity. I want to go back closer to the first years after the war. And I think that the key to understand some phenomena is to look at what happened during the war and occupation. Of course, when we look at the occupation, we see the burning buildings, we see deportations, we see forced labor. At a certain conference, I've heard something that I need to agree with, that we have hundreds of classified villages that were executions, deportations, forced labor in Germany, but we have also villages untouched. There is a conviction among young historians that taking care of the regions is not profitable because it's difficult to go out of the region and do some national research. But I believe that in researching villages, you need to specialize in a region because each region was different. Villages under occupation, unfortunately, have changed. And I'm going to pay attention to the problem of a phenomenon which is called young village intelligentsia. These are people who went to schools to try to become teachers, and this intelligentsia also exists under the occupation. Please notice how they start to tap into the economic reality. But look at the photographs from the time of the occupation in central Poland, how different this youth is, engaged in conspiration. These boys, how they're dressed in military clothes, girls with scarves on their heads, beautiful dresses. There is a transfer of various goods from the cities to the countryside. And of course, there is also this reality which is astonishing at times. So the engagement of youth in the conspiration and the effects of that. Nobody is taking care of these subjects like the peasants' battalions. It is time to look at it from a different perspective. We have amazing figures. Jan Sonta-Ośka is a person born in 1919. He's 20 years old when the war starts. He's in the middle school in Radom. Under occupation, he directs hundreds of partisans. And at the age of 26 years old, he's on the colonel of the civic militia. So it's quite natural that his soldiers follow him. Of course, this is the youth that don't want to go into home army because it's not their friend who's their supervisor, but there is the landlord or the pharmacy owner or someone from the city. So these divisions are clear. Those on the left side of the peasant movement unwillingly go into the alliance with communist authorities. They will be hurt from that quite seriously. Some of them will be linked to underground later, they will be repressed, but we have to remember that among youth that have the oppositionist approach, that they were not only pro-opposition because of their parents, grandparents, or the church. Agrarian reform, of course, yes, but I always think how this reform was perceived by the old farmers. Several years ago, I had a funny incident. I was invited to school near Puławy for a lecture, and I was talking to the teacher there, and this lady teacher said it's been 50 years since the end of the war, and when there is a quarrel at the school stadium, the children actually use the names from the times from before the war. So why the children use these names? Because they've heard it from their parents and grandparents. This is because the reform changed some things, but there was a dissonance for years, nevertheless, between the old farmers. This is like in Raymond's writing, and those who received land from the reform. Maybe in some cases this was exclusion, maybe the word is too strong, but the small owners, the folwark, as we call them, people, were willing to get into alliance with the authorities. Professor Wrona mentioned, Professor Janusz was mentioning some subject that was interested to me, and Gromadzkie Rady Narodowe, these were national councils. I've been writing a lot about it. This was the transmission belt for reading during the meetings, the orders of the supervisors, but I have to say that we do not perceive it as an element of Sovietization. And in each group, there was a group of 10, 15, 20 people who, through the activity in the council, were aware that their impact on the development of their town or village that they do have this influence. This is why Professor Janusz mentioned, and I agree with that, once this administrative form appeared, restoring the municipality and pushing away this fictitious authority from the citizen, the countryside was very much dissatisfied with that. If we look, in my opinion, at what was happening in rural areas in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, I am convinced that if you lived in the countryside, and I didn't, so I can only suspect, you could see the changes resulting from the actual or fictitious attractiveness of the state policy, because there were some elements of healthcare, development of hygiene, and housewives clubs. When I was reading about that, the most important thing was the fact how they were harmed. The building of new schools was important. Very often we are laughing at these social actions or activities. It was fictitious in the cities because people were forced to participate in carrying out some undertakings, but in the village and the engagement of the inhabitants was authentic, was real, and very often spontaneous. This is a huge difference. Now, when I see smaller towns and the schools that are just standing there completely empty with broken windows, it's sad. Later, they were often the most important places where something was happening. Also, libraries, books, what we are talking about. So, moving to the city, the social advancement, all that happened without the internet, without this easiness that we have today. It needed some foundations and engagement. Of course, we're building an image that Marcin mentioned. We don't have this joyful village, but not everything was good. So I think that the farmers have accepted the problem of obligatory deliveries. The parishes were important, but church construction in the countryside and difficulties in the implementation of that construction, in repairs, in starting new parishes, was something that couldn't be accepted by the rural population. There was a mention of Priest Sadłowski, who was a leader, and the authorities didn't allow him to build a church. And despite for this construction of religious buildings was quite dramatic. We had been talking with Mr. Sadłowski, and I remember this conversation. We talked about the problem of masses. He said that he was convinced that the entire countryside was behind him, and if someone wasn't, then that was their problem. This was a problem for him to read the papers of IPN, and he mentioned that it was horrible that he was coming to families, that these families reported on him, and these families knew that he knows that they reported on him. So those visits by the priest, that was a moment of encouraging the parishioners, was actually a traumatic experience. And the last thing, which is very interesting, are the contacts between the cities and the countryside. Professor Janusz was also writing about this. So we have this farming worker or the employee of the industrial plant who comes to work from the neighborhoods. He has a piece of land, and we have thousands of workers who originate from the countryside, and instead of going on vacation to the seaside, they go back to the countryside to help with the harvest. And we also have the okrąglaki, and you can see that they're a bit chubby, that they have family in the countryside, and their family brings them some meat. So the last thing, I think that it was a very interesting meeting, and actually there are still things to be done. In my opinion, as I've mentioned, the issue of regional approach is in this case the most important, because trying to look at all of that from the heights, we want to avoid local nuances, both in central Poland, in the north, in the south, and in the so-called recovered lands. There are a lot of them. Thank you for your attention. Ladies and gentlemen. Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, I was able to join in at the very end of today's panel, and this was a pleasure for me to listen to the interventions presented throughout the last hour. And now I have a task, it seems, to close this conference. I can't say as much as my fourth speaker, Director Piątkowski, because I was not listening to your discussion. But just very shortly, I want to comment on the 2 days of our discussions. I personally evaluate this conference as a very valuable meeting of scientists, scholars, historians that were researching the history of communism, the village and the peasantry in Russia and in CE countries. For me, the first value was that we talked about the genesis, the cause and the effects of the application of the Soviet model of agriculture to the economy of Russia and CE countries. What is important? We tried to approach this theme in a comparative way, insofar as the history of communism in these countries. I think that this is very important because comparisons show the very matter of phenomena. They allow us to see how single phenomena, single groups of people or people's attitudes look like. So through these comparisons and these discussions, I think that we've come to the conclusion that the Soviet model has achieved only a partial success, in the sense that it has been imposed on one hand, and also territorially there was a certain success, because Poland, as it turns out, was the only country that didn't accept fully the Soviet organizational model insofar as the organization of the farming production. And of course, the biggest weakness of the Soviet model was that it didn't bring about the development of agriculture itself. It actually had its impact on the fall, on the collapse of agriculture in those countries, and not ensuring its development. So the basic fault was delivering the farming effectiveness, and this was the greatest reason for the failure of this policy, both in the Soviet Union and United States. There were also micro-historical themes in this discussion, showing great problems on micro scale. So specific activists, specific villages, specific events were described that allow us to understand what was the implementation of the Soviet model of the development of agriculture in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and in CE countries after the war. So we can shortly say that the implementation of this Soviet agricultural model had two phases. The first one was offensive, so the period of the third in the Soviet Union, then after the war, this Stalinism period, and then the second stage, so trying to keep the situation as it was, the state of ownership and the communist authority. In this case, it was not about the defense by the peasants, their own identity, their own farms, but the defense of the communist state that was trying to defend itself against losing the popularity amongst the peasants in the countryside completely, and to maintain its own dominating position in the state and in the society of communist states. I would like to stress a very important quality of this conference, very interesting discussions in every single one of those panels. The discussions, the debates were very interesting, and the best researchers shared their knowledge and their experience.
I think that this panel discussion format proved to be quite efficient and successful. It's worth developing and improving. It's an interesting form of conference, even more interesting than the traditional one with plenty full of speeches that are read out, and often not that attractive way of presentation of the historic content. This discussion, or this conference and discussions that were carried out during the conference will be made available online. It's a great advantage, because we will therefore promote the scientific research on the history of the communism in the aspect of the countryside. I think it's important, because one of the biggest problems of the all scientific conference organizers is the number of participants. It's not only about our institute, the National Remembrance Institute. So if the conference organized in the reality can be viewed by only a few dozens of people, then these conferences held online, can be viewed by thousands of people. So this is a completely different scale of each and every conference that is held online. So again, thank you very much for your presence, active participation in the discussion, for your very interesting comments and remarks. I would like to invite you to the future conferences or other scientific events organized by the Institute of